I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft's Director of Grand Strategy, George Beebe. Beebe spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor. His career has included serving as director of the CIA's Russia Analysis, being the director of the CIA's Open Source Center, and serving as a staff advisor on Russia matters to Vice President Dick Cheney. In this conversation, we'll be discussing Donald Trump's recent frustrations with Vladimir Putin, as well as issues pertaining to U.S. foreign policy, the emergence of a multipolar order, and the Russia-Ukraine war. Believe it or not, the Russia-Ukraine conflict is one of the most hot-button issues for my listeners. I'd say that my listenership is split 50-50 on what the U.S. should be doing with regards to policy as it relates to this war. In the next few days, we'll hear from independent journalist Tom Much for a different perspective on the war. Expect to hear more exploration of this topic in the future from various viewpoints. And if you have any guest suggestions to cover this topic, let me know at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I'm trying to really get a diverse range of guests on to discuss this matter further, especially given how long this war has grinded on. With all that being said, let's get right to it with George Beebe. Welcome to Parallax Views, a first-time guest coming from the Quincy Institute. He's the director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute, actually, and former director of the CIA's Russia Analysis. How are you doing, George Beebe?
I'm doing great. Thanks for the invitation.
So I know I had scheduled you to come on to talk about Russia-Ukraine, Trump's sort of about face on Putin, but one area that I wanted to start with, because you've talked about it quite a bit, and I think it's part of the bigger picture here, is the move towards multipolarity. And some see multipolarity as a path to greater global balance, others as a recipe for instability and great power war. And I kind of lean towards the late Kenneth Waltz view that a bipolar system is probably more stable. Where do you come down, though? And what should U.S. strategy look like in this shifting landscape? Because whether one thinks multipolarity is good or bad, it seems like it's a reality and we have to deal with it.
Well, yeah, multipolarity is a reality. We do have to deal with it. I think the Trump administration understands this. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, gave an interview with Fox News shortly after becoming secretary, where he said, look, we are dealing with a multipolar world, and that means that the United States is going to have to approach things in a different way. We're not the global hegemon anymore. We're not the world's sole superpower. And we have to take into account that we have rivals that in turn have capabilities that we can't simply override all the time. We're going to have to, understand that we're trying to achieve a balance. That balance will in part require deterrence. but it will also require diplomacy so that these relationships don't escalate into great power conflict, which would not turn out well for any of the great powers involved, including the United States. So, yeah, we are dealing with a new situation, and it's more complex. There are more factors to take into account. One thing about a bipolar world is that there's less complexity to it. You have a single counterpart, a single rival that you have to deal with, and in many ways that's simpler to do than an order in which you have multiple actors, great powers, regional powers, medium powers, all with their own interests, all with an ability to draw some lines about what they're going to accept and what they're not going to accept. And that is a more difficult balancing act to pull off by its nature. So this is a diplomatic challenge for the United States.
In that regard, and then we'll move on to Russia and Ukraine. What do you think the risks and maybe benefits are of multipolarity?
Well, the benefit, I think, might be that it will encourage the United States to do some things that it should have done anyway. We've been living beyond our means for a long time. And the proof of that is the $36 trillion national debt that is getting bigger by the day. And what that means is we've taken on objectives in the world that are beyond our capabilities. And in order to heal the United States at home, to get our own act in order domestically, both in our economics and in our politics and in our social relationships, we're going to have to be less ambitious about what we're trying to do overseas. We can't approach the world and say the only way the United States can be secure and prosperous is if we transform the rest of the world, if we change other countries internally into liberal, Western democracies. That's beyond our capability, and I would argue that was beyond our capability even during the unipolar era. But now, I think the emergence of a multipolar order really puts an exclamation point on that reality. So the benefit may be that the United States doesn't deceive itself any longer, that we can do a lot more in the world than we actually can. What we do have to do is recognize that in this multipolar order, we have to prioritize. We have to understand what's most important to American security and American prosperity. We have to look at foreign policy as a shield of our republic, rather than a sword, rather than something that we do evangelically to convert the unwashed masses of the world to our way of doing things. And I think that that can be salutary for the United States if we understand that a lot more clearly.
And then the second part of that question, do you think there's any risks that we have to be aware of?
Oh, absolutely. I think we got into some bad habits during that post-Cold War period of unipolarity, where we didn't have to engage in traditional diplomacy, traditional balancing of the power and interests of other nations in the world, because we didn't think we had to. Our power was just so disproportionately greater than others. We could simply say, look, this is what you're going to do, and if you don't like it, too bad. We can force you to do it. And in many cases, we did. The danger now is that, in a period of great complexity, where we have some difficult challenges in front of us, balancing the interests and the power of other countries, so that we achieve stability, that we've lost our mojo diplomatically. We've lost that art of give and take, of prioritization, of understanding our own interests, distinguishing between what is absolutely critical to the United States and what things are simply nice to do. Were we able to pull them off? That's one big danger in all of this, that we're not up to the challenge because we've gotten into bad habits. Another danger is that during the unipolar period, we grew very attached to deterrence as the universal solvent for all international problems. You don't like what another country is doing? Well, we need even more deterrence, which we tended to regard as exclusively military deterrence. And the problem is that although deterrence is oftentimes a necessary ingredient, it oftentimes has to be leavened with diplomacy so that you don't get into what international relations theorists call a spiral model or a security dilemma problem, where things that you think you're doing to enhance your own security are viewed as threatening by other countries and provoke a counter reaction that you get into a tit for tat cycle of action and reaction that leads to escalation and ultimately confrontation. In other words, we've regarded every problem in the world as a World War II problem, as a Hitler problem. How do you deal with the Nazis? Well, the only language they understand is force and military might. So that's what we have to do. And we've forgotten that, World War I and that kind of problem has always been out there, where you get into a situation where nobody is actually seeking a war. You don't have a clear aggressor, but lots of states are concerned that military measures one country is taking actually threaten them, and they have to respond, and you get into a cycle that gets out of hand. And I think one of the dangers we face in a multipolar world, particularly one where we don't have the diplomatic skills we once had, is that we get into these escalatory spirals, thinking that the way we deal with all these countries is solely through deterrence.
It sounds like what you're saying, and it's a point that I've made, and especially with Russia, Ukraine, is that I don't think most wars end with like the total victory scenario. They usually end in negotiations. Can you speak to that? And maybe we can speak to that specifically with regards to Russia, Ukraine.
Well, yeah. Again, this is an example of World War II perhaps spoiling American expectations as to how wars will end. Because we insisted there on unconditional surrender, we're thinking that the only just end to wars is when the enemy, whom we regard as evil, is forced to capitulate unconditionally, and the forces of truth and justice prevail. That usually isn't how wars end historically. Certainly wasn't how World War I ended, and not how the bulk of wars have ended historically. And it's certainly not going to end that way in Ukraine. It's already clear that Ukraine does not have sufficient manpower, and the combined military industry of Europe, the United States, and Ukraine does not have sufficient capacity to outlast the Russians in what has become a war of attrition. The Russians have 5 times the manpower of Ukraine. Their military factories are generating missiles and artillery shells at many multiples the rate of the combined output of Ukrainian, European, and American industry. And the Ukrainians have already shown on the battlefield in their failed 2023 counteroffensive that they can't drive the Russians back. They can't recapture land that Russia holds right now in Ukraine. So clearly the war is not going to end in some kind of Ukrainian unconditional victory. I think that's also true on the Russian side. The Russians, although they are winning the war of attrition by grinding down Ukraine, exhausting its manpower, exhausting Western stockpiles of weapons, they're not engaged in some sort of blitzkrieg breakthrough that will result in capturing Kyiv, capturing the vast majority of Ukrainian territory. I think the best the Russians can expect is that they can carve off a pretty good sized chunk of eastern and southern Ukraine, and then declare victory, dig in, build defensive fortifications, and say, okay, we won. But that is going to leave a Ukrainian state behind. And we're either going to have some sort of peace settlement, or I think the Russians will leave Ukraine in an unsettled state where there is no treaty, no agreement. But that in turn means that Ukraine can't be reconstructed economically. So the Russians won't allow it unless there's a peace treaty. They don't want that rump Ukraine to turn into an ally of the United States, a member of NATO, or a host to American or European military forces. And their best guarantee that that won't happen is to keep the war unsettled, ensure that nobody invests the many hundreds of billions of dollars that are required to rebuild Ukraine, and leave Ukraine as sort of an open wound in Europe that won't be a threat to Russia in any substantial way anyways, but also will be the West's problem to deal with. And that will be a tragedy. It will be a tragedy first and foremost for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian people, but also for stability in Europe. It's going to be very difficult to put in place the kinds of diplomatic measures and stable balances of military forces that are going to be necessary to minimize the likelihood of new crises emerging in Europe, escalatory spirals over other parts of Europe, Belarus, Kaliningrad, Moldova, for example, the Balkans, all of which are still there, all of which could be triggers for some sort of new escalatory spiral. So, my view on this is that it's very much in everybody's interest, and I would say Russia's too, not to have that kind of outcome, but to find a way to bring the war to a negotiated compromise settlement.
Now, this brings us to President Trump's sort of what people are calling his about face on Russia Ukraine. He's saying we need to provide more aid, more U.S. military assistance for NATO to provide to Ukraine. What do you make of this? And this sort of I think it's an indicator of White House frustration with Russia.
Well, there's no question that the White House is frustrated with Russia. President Trump is openly saying that he's frustrated with Russia, using very colorful language to describe his frustration with Russia. So nobody fails to get that. And I think there are a couple of aspects to this. One is, why are we in a situation where a president that has come into office saying this war needs to end, has he not been able to achieve that goal, which, as I said earlier, is very much a necessary goal in my view? The second is, are the measures that he is talking about now, these changed tactics, are they going to bring about a successful diplomatic settlement of the war? And I would say part of what he has called for is necessary, and that is the continuing military support to Ukraine. That's something that is necessary to do while we're negotiating, because if the United States and Europe don't continue military support to Ukraine, the Russians will have very little incentive not to simply seek a military solution to this conflict. The Russians need to be in a position where they have to compromise, they have to negotiate, not simply dictate the terms of a settlement. So military aid to Ukraine is, in my opinion, a necessary part of a negotiating strategy. The other part of this is, how do you go about negotiating? And here's where I think Trump has gotten himself into some trouble. Because he pledged to end this war in a day, he put time pressure on himself. He raised expectations in the United States. Now, not everybody took that seriously. I think a lot of people chalked this up to rather typical Trumpian hyperbola, and he himself acknowledges that there was an element of that. But nonetheless, those sorts of promises do bring with them time pressure to show results in all of this. And that, in turn, I think led to a tactical error in the Trump team's negotiating strategy. They decided they were going to seek a ceasefire as step one. Let's get the two sides simply to stop shooting at each other. Once they've stopped shooting, the pressure is off on negotiations. You have the luxury of negotiating what are inevitably going to be time-consuming, complex issues over a less fraught period of time, which will be months, if not years. But Trump then can say, hey, look, I got the ceasefire, right? I have an achievement. It didn't happen as quickly as I wanted, but it's a significant win, and we're going to follow this up by concluding, a larger settlement deal over time. The problem with that approach is that the Russians, because they're winning on the battlefield, and because their advantages on the battlefield really are their negotiating leverage in any settlement talks, they're not going to give up that edge unless they have a pretty good sense that their most important interests in this war are addressed up front. Before you give up leverage, you got to make sure that you're going to achieve the things that you absolutely have to achieve. So the Russian approach to the ceasefire is essentially no. We're not going to agree to an unconditional ceasefire immediately, trusting that the United States will one day ultimately probably address the core interests that the Russians have in this conflict. They want to get those taken care of up front. And what I think that means for the Trump administration is pursuing an unconditional ceasefire as step one was a dead end. That was doomed to fail. It was inevitably going to produce the kind of frustration that Trump is expressing right now. I think what should have happened and what should still happen is that Trump first brokers a framework agreement that lays out a basic geopolitical compromise as step one. And that geopolitical compromise is really not between Ukraine and Russia. It's between Russia and the West, Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States. Because the Russians, for many years prior to this invasion, said the prospect of Ukraine being a NATO ally, a NATO member, or hosting US or European military forces that in turn could threaten Russia, those are red lines. Those are things that Russia regards as existential threats to Russian security. And they indicated very clearly they would go to war to prevent those threats from materializing, which is what they did. They're not going to end that war. They're not going to agree to a ceasefire until they have concrete assurances, not only that Ukraine will not be in NATO, but NATO will not be in Ukraine. NATO forces, European peacekeepers, American military facilities will not be in Ukraine. And that's the issue that I think is absolutely critical to nail down in a binding framework agreement first. But Trump shouldn't simply concede that without reciprocal concessions on Russia's part. If he does, this is not a saleable deal in Europe, in the United States, or in Ukraine. Nobody's going to say, "Hey, good outcome. We ratify this as an acceptable peace deal." the Russians have to give up something in return that matters. And that, in my opinion, is acceding to Ukraine's future membership in the European Union, so that Ukraine would end up being militarily neutral, but economically and politically tied to the EU. That, I think, is a good outcome for Ukraine, and probably the only one that would be acceptable both in Russia and in Ukraine and in the West.
I know I'm going to have listeners that as soon as you mention NATO, they'll say, "Oh, he's saying that the Russian invasion is just because of the NATO expansion." And I don't think that's your position or Anatol Lieven's position for that matter, or anyone else I've spoken to at Quincy. Do you think there's a gap that people have when talking about understanding how Russia thinks versus um, accepting what Russia thinks as being correct?
Right. As an analyst, you do have to understand the perceptions of adversaries, what's driving them, what's motivating them, how they understand their own interests. If you don't understand that, you can't come to reasonable diplomatic understandings that protect your own interests, but are also respectful of the core interests of the other side. Of course, that's the basis for diplomacy. You have to find that sweet spot where you've protected the things that are most important to you, but also understood what's most important to the other side. Now, in between those two positions are areas that I would call nice to have things. Things that if we could achieve them, that would be great, but we don't have to. They're not essential. And that's the area in which bargaining can take place. So to me, to understand that the Russians perceive the prospect of the West being ensconced militarily in Ukraine as a threat for Russia is not to say that those perceptions are right or justified or good. You don't have to say, here's how they perceive things and they're right. You simply have to say, here's how they perceive things. Otherwise, you can't engage in diplomacy, and you can't understand what threats are coming down the road, which is part of the reason why so many people in the West got surprised by this invasion, but they shouldn't have been.
Just a few more questions there. I wanted to ask you, I know this is outside of Trump, but I'm curious, do you think it's important that we look back on how Biden dealt with all of this? I was recently speaking to someone who said that and they were very pro-Ukraine, pro-aid to Ukraine and military assistance to Ukraine, but they sort of said to me, there was no real strategy, it seemed like, with Biden. And it seems like there is consensus now that there has been a lack of strategy on the US's part when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I agree. I think our approach was strategically weak in two dimensions. One was at the level of grand strategy. And what I mean by that is looking at this big question of the evolving world order and the challenges that the United States faces. Right now, we've got a situation where China has become a peer rival. They are a peer economically, they're increasingly a peer technologically, and their military capabilities are evolving to the point where when it comes to the US versus China in the immediate vicinity of China, on its home turf, so to speak, we've got ourselves a real peer. Now, is China, a global peer? Can they project power, into Europe and, Africa and elsewhere in the world the way the United States can? No, not yet anyways. There's still a big gap there. But this is a reality that in turn dictates certain approaches to Russia, to Europe. What you don't want to do in a situation where you're facing that kind of peer is to drive China together with Russia in ways that make your challenge even greater than they otherwise would be. We don't want to walk into a two-front geopolitical conflict. It's in our interests to at least have the Russia-China relationship more normal, not a close entente or even an alliance against the United States. And I think we failed in dealing with Ukraine and Russia in that regard. So that's a failure of grand strategy. Then there was a failure of military strategy in this. We had a belief that we could so increase to Russia the costs of this invasion, economic costs, political costs, military costs, that Russia would simply say, oh, it's not worth it, right? We're isolated in the world diplomatically. That's not where we want to be. Our economy is under great pressure from sanctions. That's not where we want to be. We're losing men and equipment on the battlefield. We can't sustain this. And the hope was that by increasing the pain on Russia in all these dimensions, that the Russians would simply say, hey, this was a mistake. How do we get out of this? The problem with that latter approach was we didn't understand that the Russians regarded this war not as an elective, not as a nice to do, but rather an existential issue for Russia. And when you're dealing with an issue that you think is of existential importance, you're going to sustain enormous pain politically, economically, militarily, because you think the alternative is, guess what? You're out of business. Russia goes away. It gets broken up. It gets turned into some sort of subordinate to the United States in the West. And the Russians have been, I think, from the start, willing to put up with enormous pain in order to preclude that outcome. And I think that was a failure. Now, lastly, I would say the Biden administration, once it acted to make sure that the Russians couldn't seize Kyiv, that they weren't going to mount what essentially was a coup to replace the Zelensky government and put in place a Russia-friendly puppet government in Ukraine. Once they prevented that, they didn't know how to end the war if their pain strategy wasn't working. And it became clear pretty quickly that the pain strategy wasn't working. So they settled into this slogan of, well, as long as it takes, we'll just sustain these sanctions, this military aid, this diplomatic isolation strategy for as long as it takes. But they never said, as long as it takes to do what? You know, what's our goal? You know, if you have a strategy, you have to have a clear goal, and you have to make sure that the tools that you're using are sufficient to achieve the goal. And we didn't have a clear goal, and we didn't have tools that were sufficiently coercive to force the Russians to say uncle in Ukraine. So I think that was a big problem. And now we're in a different kind of problem. I think the Trump administration has articulated a clear goal. They want a peace settlement. They want an end to the fighting. But they haven't gotten their diplomatic act together in order to do the things that are necessary to bring about that end.
In terms of negotiations, what do you think? What do you think? What type of guarantees do you think will need to be made both for Russia, but also because I think sometimes we overlook it, because I think a lot of people view this as almost like just a proxy between the U.S. and Russia. But I think we also have to include like Ukraine in all of this discussion. What are Ukraine's guarantees that it needs in terms of negotiations?
Well, the Ukrainians would like Article 5 style security guarantees from the United States and Europe that would enable them to feel comfortable that if the Russians were to invade again in the future, that the West would come riding in and defend Ukraine militarily. And I would want that if I were in their shoes. I think any country would want that. The question is, can they get that? And my reaction to that is no. The United States has already demonstrated that it is not going to go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine. We demonstrated that under Barack Obama in 2014. when, in the wake of the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, the Russians annexed Crimea, and the Obama administration made clear that although we didn't like this, we were not going to go to war with Russia to defend Ukrainian territory. The Trump administration was not willing to do that. In Trump's first term, Biden demonstrated that after the invasion, we were not going to put boots on the ground. We were not going to risk World War III, as he put it, to defend Ukraine. And it's quite clear that the second iteration of the Trump administration is not going to do that either. And the Europeans can't. The Europeans just don't have the military capability to go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine. So although Ukraine would like guarantees, they're not going to get them. What they can, I think, realistically aspire to is a set of assurances that make the likelihood of a new Russian invasion low, not zero. You're not going to get a guarantee, but we can do some things that would make it very unlikely that the Russians will invade. What are those things? Well, membership in the EU is one of them. That's something that would, I think, cause Russia to think twice before reinvading, knowing that they're not just attacking Ukraine, they're attacking a member of the European Union, which, although it's not explicitly a military alliance, nonetheless would be a dangerous thing for Russia to do, at least not in a premeditated, aggressive way. We can also do some things to reconstruct Ukraine. And if you have a compromised settlement of the war, then investors probably will have sufficient confidence that things won't reignite, that they will invest in reconstructing Ukraine. And with reconstruction, the chances that Ukrainian refugees will return go up. And that's an important part of strength. For Ukraine to be healthy and capable of defending itself, it has to have a sufficiently large population. And right now they're in a demographic crisis. A lot of people have left the country. The birth rate is plummeted. They've sustained large losses on the battlefield, well beyond what the Western media have reported. Unless they can attract refugees back into the country in substantial numbers, they're not going to have an army that can handle the Western weapons that could be provided, after a settlement. So that's a critical part of building deterrence. It's restoring Ukraine's demographic, economic, and political coherence, so that it has the resilience to not be a tempting target for Russia to reinvade.
Before closing out, I know another issue that comes up a lot with all of this is concessions that will need to be made for a peace settlement to happen. I'm noticing on the Ukrainian side, I have Ukrainians that have said to me, well, if we can't get Crimea back, then so be it, as long as we get to exist as Ukraine and not some kind of vassal state. I do think we're moving towards a point where certain maximalist demands, at least on the Ukrainian side, maybe on the Russian side as well, are sort of being lowered. The expectations are being lowered. Would you agree with that assessment? And can you speak to that?
Well, it's not surprising as Ukraine's battlefield position deteriorates that their demands in a negotiation are starting to moderate a little bit. On the Russian side, the problem is that as Russia's battlefield momentum increases, their appetites at the negotiating table grow. So how do you deal with that? My reaction is, if the United States treats this as first and foremost a negotiation between Russia and Ukraine, where they have to work out compromises between each other, the Ukrainians are going to be in a pretty weak position. And the Russians are going to be in a very strong position where they're dictating terms of a settlement. That's not a good outcome, in my opinion. What has to happen, I think, is that yes, there are some aspects of this war that have to be negotiated bilaterally between Ukraine and Russia. But there are very important aspects to this war that are really a geopolitical struggle between Russia and the United States. And that's something that has to be worked out first and foremost between Moscow and Washington. And the leverage that we have in that area is leverage over the broader European security theater. The Russians can't solve their broader security problem with NATO simply by conquering more territory in Ukraine. They're still going to face an enlarged alliance. It's doubled in size since the end of the Cold War, from 16 to 32 member states. It's a much larger economy than Russia's. It's got a higher level of technology. And it could well end up deploying new missile systems on European territory that are profoundly threatening to Russia, and something that the Russians can't do anything about simply by winning the war in Ukraine. So that's our leverage in all of this. And I think we need to make clear to the Russians that the path toward stability in Europe and the path toward addressing some of those bigger security challenges that the Russians are afraid of has to go through a reasonable compromise settlement of the war in Ukraine.
Before closing out, I have to be honest, my audience on this issue of the Russia-Ukraine war is, like, I would say 50-50, split down the middle. Some want the war to end immediately. Others say, no, we need to keep supporting Ukraine. And I think there's this line that people have. They either believe that this is all about Russia trying to expand territorially, or that it's just Russia is afraid of more and more NATO expansion. How do you think we can thread the needle when it comes to these debates? Because I feel like it can get very heated at times, and there's a lot of name calling. Do you think there's a way that we can come to a sort of consensus point?
Well, I'm a realist, both in my approach to foreign policy and my approach to politics generally. And the reality is we're probably not going to come to an easy consensus on these things. There's always going to be a debate. That said, I think the war has elements of both of these points. Clearly, the Russians do have territorial ambitions. That is a part of this. There was an entanglement of Ukraine and Russia in the aftermath of many wars over the past, century plus, and we're dealing with the legacy of all of that history. We're dealing with the situation that came out of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Those are complex issues. They involve territory, language, culture, intermixing of families, economic ties. And then layered on top of that, of course, we have NATO expansion and Russia's traditional fear that the loss of geographic distance makes Russia more vulnerable to military attack from abroad. So these issues are all in play here, and you can't simply say, well, it's only about NATO, period, or it's only about territory, period. It's both. But that means we have to be nuanced in our approach to settling this war. We have to do so in a way that understands the intermixing of these factors and the complexity involved. We can't just treat this as a bilateral conflict between Ukraine and Russia over where the border is going to lie. There are other big issues at stake here. If we don't address them, we're going to fail in our settlement efforts.
And very last thing I forgot to mention earlier, what do you make of the I guess there's supposed to be talks happening between Russia and Ukraine tomorrow, Wednesday the 23rd, that's going to be hosted by Turkey. Do you think anything will come of this, or?
Well, I don't know. when the Russians and Ukrainians first met in Istanbul under Turkish auspices in 2022, in the weeks after the Russian invasion, they made some pretty significant progress, it appeared, on advancing toward a compromise settlement. Most of those negotiations, though, didn't actually take place in Istanbul around the negotiating table. Most of them occurred in a back channel where key representatives in Moscow and in Kiev were working to find a way forward. And the delegations in Istanbul simply put down on paper what was being discussed in those private channels. So when you ask me, how will things go in Istanbul? My reaction is, well, I don't know, because I think it depends on whether there's anything going on in a back channel. And almost by definition, if there's a confidential back channel at work, we're not going to know about it in public. If we do, then that's a problem. It's probably not going to work. But I will say this, the key to success really is Moscow and Washington reaching that geopolitical compromise that I talked about earlier. If we can work out something in that area, then I think the Russians and Ukrainians probably have a pretty good chance of putting something down on paper that can lead to a settlement and can facilitate a ceasefire.
Well, I want to thank you again, George Beebe, for coming on Parallax Views. I always ask at the end of the conversation if there's anything you would like my listeners to get out of this conversation. And also, if you can, how can my listeners keep up with your work?
Well, as you mentioned at the start, I'm at the Quincy Institute. So my work and that of the Institute can be found on our website, quincyinst.org. So I would encourage people that are interested to go to the site and surf around. And I think there's a lot of interesting material there, not just on Russia, Ukraine, Europe, but in all of the key areas of the world.
Thank you so much, George Beebe, for coming on Parallax Views.
Thank you for the invitation.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mark M, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, JC, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y, Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff It's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.